Ladies and gentlemen, the chair now recognizes Lawrence King, Jr., a member of the Nebraska delegation, for the singing of the national anthem.
I became involved in the case in Nebraska. It's called the Franklin cover-up. And in that particular case, I learned that they were, there was an international child kidnapping ring operating out of Iowa and Nebraska. They had, the Franklin Savings and Loan was raided by the IRS and the FBI. As a result of the publicity, 80 children came forward and said that they were victims in a large-scale pedophile ring. Of the 80 who came forward, 4 gave statements, 2 recanted, 2 refused to recant, Alicia Owens and Paul Bonacci. The 2 refused to recant. I went back and interviewed them. I talked to them. I helped develop the case. The investigator before me was murdered, by the way, and I didn't really replace him because he was a full-time investigator, and John DeCamp had just asked me to come back and kind of fill in until like we could, work it more extensively. But we learned from talking to these kids that this large-scale pedophile ring was not only involved in pedophilia, they were involved in pornography, they were involved in satanic occult activity. The kids were attended these ceremonies with robes chanting, human sacrifices, and these were not dirtbags off the street. This was the past publisher of the Omaha World Herald. This was the chief of police, Bob Wadman. This was the head of the Nebraska Forestry Service, Eugene Mahoney. These kids named all these individuals, some of the top citizens in Omaha, Nebraska. The case went actually nowhere. The main agency that blocked it, kept it from going forward, was the FBI. But they were taking these kids out of orphanages, foster homes, Boys Town. They were driving them in private limousines from Omaha, Nebraska to Sioux City, Iowa, placing them in private jets, flying them to Washington, D.C. For sex orgy parties with congressmen and senators, and of course they would blackmail the congressmen and the senators. Paul Bonacci, one of the kids who was talking, told me how when he was 14, 15, 16, they would take him out and to a shopping mall, a park, a public place, to try to attract the kids over, his age, over near the car. The adults would grab them, make off with them, and put these kids in a safe house, and so forth. Paul told me, I said, what do they do with these kids, Paul? He said, well, they auction them off, and he'd been to two locations, Las Vegas and Toronto, Canada. I said, how many auctions have you attended? He said, 6. And I said, how many kids were auctioned off at each one? He said, there were as few as 6 and as many as 36. I said, how much money do they get for one of these kids? They sell for $50,000. 36 times $50,000 is a bundle of money. What happens to kids afterwards, Paul? They're using satanic ceremonies. They're put on airplanes, foreigners that don't speak English, planes with no markings on them. Now, wait a minute, FAA's got to be involved in that. We got planes coming in here with no markings. They're put in campers. They're sent overseas, probably for, well, I've been told, for body parts, for sex slaves, and what have you. Big business, right? So Paul said that he was part of the kidnapping ring. There have been several attempts to kill Paul.
But Paul Bonacci, when he was 10, 11, 12 years old, was recruited by these people to be one of them and to act as a buffer and in shopping centers, parks, public places, to attract the children his age over near the car. The adults involved in the ring would grab them and they would kidnap them. The kids, of course, talked about satanic cult ceremonies. They talked about the kidnapping ring. Paul's life has been turned upside down because he refused to recant, as did Alicia Owens, the other person who refused to recant. Alicia's still serving time in prison for lying to the grand jury. She was convicted of that. When she was 14 years old, she had sex with the chief of police, Bob Wadman. That's what she said. And the other kids backed her up. Other top businessmen who were identified were Harold Anderson, publisher of the Omaha World Herald, the head of the Society page in Omaha, Eugene Mahoney, who was a former Vice Squad police officer in Omaha and is now head of the Forestry Service for the state of Nebraska. And the list goes on and on and on. The pedophile ring, they were transporting these kids from Omaha to Des Moines, to Minneapolis, to Milwaukee, to Madison, and back to Omaha.
When I first got involved, I was molested by an airman from Offutt Air Force Base who was involved in Monarch. His job was to recruit kids from the local neighborhood who he could make dissociate by doing traumatic things to them at a very young age. Later on, when they get to school age, they would simply pick me up at school, and I would simply miss a day or two for training.
Now, is it your testimony that there was a United States plan or plot which intended to create multiple personality syndrome or dissociative personalities in children?
Yes, to my knowledge.
And that you were a victim of a plot of the United States, and that's when your multiple personalities first began to develop?
Yes.
And now, what is your understanding of the reason that Monarch wanted children with dissociative disorders or multiple personality disorders?
Because if one was captured in the future spying, the personality or the person that was captured would go into a personality that would have no useful information. There would be other personalities that would come out that would render the person to seem hallucinatory or to seem as if he was indeed crazy.
There was a major investigation headed up by John DeCamp, former state senator, a good friend of mine. And John had taken on the task of exposing a group of high-level politicians in the state of Nebraska and some of the top businessmen. As a result of this case, the kids who were part of the network came forward. There were 80 children because of the publicity on a pedophile pornographic arrest. 4 of them gave statements. 2 of the 4 later recanted. 2 stood by what they originally initially said. And what we developed there was that children were being taken out of orphanages and foster homes, driven to Sioux City, Iowa, 184 miles away, and flown to Washington, D.C. for sex orgy parties with congressmen and senators. The person in charge was a fellow named Larry King, a black man, not Larry King Live. And he was president of the Franklin Savings and Loan, which was a savings and loan established to help the minorities. He had a salary of $17,000 a year. He was paying $5,000 a month for a condominium in Washington, D.C. for these parties. John DeCamp has made the statement publicly that the one organization that did more than anybody else to cover up the kidnapping ring, the case in Nebraska, the pedophile ring, the homosexual ring, was the FBI. John DeCamp, who is the attorney on record for these kids, two of these kids, has publicly stated, and it's in his book, the Franklin cover-up, it's on the back there. If you don't have it, I highly recommend it, along with this video. John DeCamp has stated that the one organization that did more to cover up the Nebraska Franklin cover-up situation, cover-up case itself, was the FBI. Here's some headlines out of the Washington Times. You don't see this in the LA Times or the New York Times, by the way. This is June the 30th, 1989. Power broker served drugs, sex at parties, bug for blackmail. Craig Spence was with the CIA, and his job, along with some other nefarious individuals, was to set up the congressmen, senators, dignitaries for blackmail. There was one FBI agent in Omaha and another one in Chicago, a team of 5, who traveled around the country and did some of their dirty works. There was a restaurant in New York City that was bugged, video and audio, specifically for the purpose of setting up congressmen, dignitaries, senators, etc.
Top Japanese politician linked to Spence, that's Craig Spence. Craig Spence was a CIA operative whose specialty was to set up and blackmail prominent politicians, dignitaries, ambassadors, and so forth. And once they were blackmailed, then, of course, our government, mainly the CIA, for the most part, had them in their hip pocket.
So you were trained actually to be a spy
Yes.
on behalf of the program known as Monarch,
Yes.
for the purpose of ultimately taking over the government of the United States.
Yes.
So these kids, some of these children were also taken to the Republican National Convention in New Orleans and also in Dallas, Texas. It's a typical situation. Now, when it comes time to vote on a particular bill, and somebody comes around and says, I want you to vote this way because you remember we were at that party the other day and there was that 10-year-old kid back in the bedroom with you, how do you think he's going to vote, right? And I might mention that the kids all placed George Bush at one of those parties when he was vice president. Our George Bush, which doesn't surprise me, of course. Okay.
And the reason that the individuals in charge of the program wanted children with dissociative personalities or multiple personalities was so that they would not reveal the information that they gathered, if captured, in one of their other personas.
Yes, if captured or in any other normal activity.
John DeCamp, an attorney, filed a lawsuit against Larry King, who was the leader of the operation and the president of the Franklin Savings and Loan. And he had $1 million judgment February the 9th of last year. Received $1 million judgment. So,
and people said, well, gosh, aren't you afraid of being sued? You're naming some of the most potent and powerful folk in this entire state, the people that pull the chains and call the shots. And I said, yeah, I know they do. And that's why it's so serious. That's why it's so terrible. And I said, am I afraid of being sued? No, heck, well, I think it'd be good for them to sue me. Let's find out the truth.
Paul Bonacci has drawn the living quarters of the inside of the White House.
When were you programmed?
I was programmed beginning in 1974.
Were you trained in the area of of prostitution and homosexuality?
Yes,
And where did that training take place?
off Air Force Base. My initial program was to, as a young man, get adults who were powerful political leaders into positions where they could be compromised.
That was your
And
mission?
That was the initial mission. The whole mission was for me to go into the military service and become an officer. And a few years after that, retire from the service. Not retire after 20 years, but after 6 years. And move to Germany. And then their initial plan to take over or to run the government was to put me in an ambassador spot. And then later to come back to the United States and to run for an office, and they would be the ones who controlled everything that I did.
So you would be an operative, so to speak?
I would be a puppet.
A puppet.
I was created by a government program,
Which government program?
Monarch.
And what is Monarch?
Monarch is an operation that was created by the United States government to create spies for other countries. They use children for the purpose that they are easily integrated into multiple personalities because they can dissociate. Monarch is a program that is run by Michael Angelo Aquino, who was an Army Reserve colonel at Presidio. He is also the leader of the Temple of Set. He also runs a child daycare center. He also is involved in human sacrifice.
Is he employed by the United States?
Yes,
At what facility?
Presidio, California.
Is that in San Francisco area? Presidio
Yes.
Naval Base?
Yes.
Do you know what rank Michael Aquino holds?
He was a colonel.
Is he currently employed there?
I am not aware of the current situation.
What were you told when you were 4 years old that you recall now about the Monarch program?
When I first got involved, I was molested by an airman from Offutt Air Force Base who was involved in Monarch. His job was to recruit kids from the local neighborhood who he could make dissociate by doing traumatic things to them at a very young age. Later on, when they get to school age, they would simply pick me up at school, and I would simply miss a day or two for training.
Now, is it your testimony that there was a United States plan or plot which intended to create multiple personality syndrome or dissociative personalities in children,
Yes, to my knowledge.
and that you were a victim of a plot of the United States, and that that's when your multiple personalities first began to develop?
Yes.
When did you become aware that you were part of Monarch?
I knew that I was aware of Monarch the whole time, as Wesley.
From 4 years old forward,
At my creation.
1974.
Yes.
So that would be from 7 years forward. You were aware of the creation of Wesley and the plan and the concept of the United States to cause you to dissociate.
Yes. I only knew of Colonel Aquino because I was also involved in the Temple of Set, in human sacrifice.
Is he employed by the United States?
Yes.
At what facility?
Presidio, California.
Is that in San Francisco area? Presidio
Yes.
Naval Base?
Yes.
Do you know what rank Michael Aquino holds?
He was a colonel.
Is he currently employed there?
I am not aware of the current situation.
Now, describe the program again, the Monarch program.
Monarch, as I said, was a program that used children to make multiple personalities for future use as spies and as a way to take over the United States government. The personalities were created at the first.
Excuse me, who was intending to take over the United States government?
I do not know that information.
Did you understand Mr. Aquino to be working on behalf of the United States or against the United States?
I believed he was working on behalf of the United States.
So some segment of the United States was trying to take over the United States government?
The plan that Aquino had in it was he wanted to usher in the Antichrist, which is talked about in the Bible.
And this was a government-sponsored program?
Yes.
You were 7 years old at the time that you were recruited?
I was actually 3 years old when it first began, but I was not created until later on.
Who created you?
I was created by Monarch.
Do you mean Mr. Aquino? Who in Monarch created you?
I was created by Monarch. I do not know who.